My name is Clara Wren. I am 27 years old, and I haven't breathed properly in 3 years. Not since I buried my grandfather. Not since I left behind the only place I ever felt real. Not since I stood in front of the old red barn and told a horse I didn't have the strength to love anything anymore. And now I'm back where the air smells like pine and earth and ghosts. Back where the silence isn't peaceful. It presses. And in that silence, I know he's still here. Waiting. The gravel crunched beneath my boots as I stepped out of the car. The wind greeted me with a brittle whisper, lifting the edge of my coat like a cold hand brushing against my ribs. I paused. The cottage stood unchanged. Peeling green shutters, sagging porch rail, chimney leaning just slightly as if bowing to the past. Place frozen in time, or maybe it was me who never moved on. I dropped my keys into my coat pocket, the jingle startling against the hush. A single crow cawed in the distance. I stared out across the small pasture behind the barn, expecting emptiness. But he was there. Storm. His outline shimmered in the mist like something half-remembered, half-feared. He stood still beneath the bare tree at the pasture's edge, black coat gleaming even in the dull light, mane tousled by the wind. For a second, I thought he wasn't real, just a memory conjured up by grief. Then he shifted. One step forward, then still. My breath caught. I felt it all at once. The pressure in my chest, the years lost, the unspoken words still lodged in my throat. My grandfather's voice echoed faintly in my mind. If that horse trusts you, Clara, don't you dare betray it. But I had. 3 years ago, I had driven away without saying goodbye. Storm had galloped after the car until I turned onto the main road. I'd watched him vanish in the rearview mirror like a part of me snapping off, and now here we were. Me, a woman unraveling, and him, still watching. Inside the cottage, the air was stale, untouched. Dust coated the wooden table and the empty picture frame still hanging crooked on the wall. I left my bags by the door and moved through the rooms on autopilot. Living room, kitchen, his bedroom. The old kettle was still on the stove. His boots, lined neatly under the coat rack. He had left things as if he meant to return, but he never did. One heart attack. One call in the middle of the night. That was all it took to shatter everything. I ended up in the back room, my old room. I hadn't set foot in it since I was 18. The walls were still pale yellow. The bed still covered with that ridiculous quilt my grandmother had sewn together from worn flannel shirts. I sat down slowly, pressing my palms against the mattress as if it might disappear. The tears came quietly. No sobbing, no drama, just wet cheeks and hollow lungs. I didn't know what I was doing here, only that the city had become too loud and too gray. And that one morning, after lying awake until dawn, I bought a one-way ticket and left everything behind. My job, my boyfriend, my half-finished apartment with its sterile walls. None of it mattered anymore, only Storm. The barn loomed ahead as the sun dipped toward the hills. I hadn't meant to go out that evening. I told myself I'd wait until morning. But something pulled me. That same invisible thread that had bound me to this place since childhood. I trudged across the brittle grass, my boots damp with thawing frost. The barn door creaked like it remembered my touch. Inside, the scent hit me like a wave. Hay, leather, manure, dust. 100 memories broke loose from where I'd buried them. Storm wasn't in his stall. For a breathless moment, panic flared in my chest. Then I saw him. Just outside the side door, standing by the fence, looking toward the cottage. Toward me. He hadn't moved. He hadn't run. He knew I was here. And he was waiting. I stepped outside, careful not to move too fast. The air was sharp now, the sun just a smear of red on the horizon. He turned his head slightly, ears flicking, but didn't back away. "Hey," I said, barely above a whisper. My voice cracked. It sounded like someone else's. He blinked. That was all. I took another step, then another, until I stood at the fence, barely a meter away from him. His breath steamed in the cold air, nostrils flaring just slightly. God, he was beautiful. Taller than I remembered. Muscles coiled under that dark coat like thunder ready to break. His eyes, those deep, knowing eyes, met mine with a stillness that shattered me more than any violence ever could. "I'm sorry," I said. No reaction. Just that steady, unreadable gaze. I reached out slowly, gloved fingers trembling. I expected him to flinch, to turn away. He didn't. My hand brushed his neck. Warm. Alive. Solid. The dam inside me cracked a little more. "Do you remember me?" I whispered. His head lowered, just a little. Enough. Enough to know that he did. The days blurred after that. I didn't unpack much. I didn't call anyone. I spent my mornings in the barn, cleaning out the old stalls, brushing Storm's coat, feeding him by hand. He never shied away, but he didn't come close either. Not yet. We circled each other like ghosts, slowly closing the distance. At night, I stayed curled on the couch, blanket wrapped around me, fire burning low in the hearth. Sometimes I spoke aloud to the silence, pretending it was him, pretending my grandfather was still in the next room, still sipping tea and humming old country songs. I dreamed a lot. Of thunder, of running hooves, of a little girl with skinned knees laughing as a black colt nuzzled her face. I woke often gasping, sweat on my neck. Still not breathing right, but the mornings were better. Because Storm was there. He watched me, always. Quiet, steady, present. Until one night the storm came, and nothing would ever be the same again. They say fences are built to keep things out. But sometimes, they're just there to stop you from going in. That's how it felt with Storm. Every morning, I found myself on one side of the fence, steaming coffee mug in hand, while he stood on the other, watching me through the mist like a sentinel of my past. The cottage behind me, the empty barn beside him. The air between us filled with things unsaid. I could touch him. I had touched him. But touching and trusting weren't the same. I had to earn that. Again. On the third morning, after I returned, the fog was so thick I couldn't see the tops of the pine trees beyond the pasture. I pulled my coat tighter and stepped outside, feeling the brittle crunch of frozen grass beneath my boots. Storm was already there, near the gate this time, his body barely visible in the gray haze. Waiting. Always waiting. "Morning," I said, my voice still hoarse from sleep. He flicked one ear toward me but didn't move. I crossed the field slowly, letting the mug warm my fingers. A few birds chirped in the distance, their sound muffled by the fog. The world felt paused, like everything was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do. I stopped at the gate. Storm watched. Still like the stone statues in old gardens, like he could stand there for centuries and never blink. I leaned against the post and took a sip of coffee. "You used to come running when I brought you carrots, remember?" He didn't move, just breathed, slow and deliberate. I glanced at the barn. I'd cleaned out his stall the day before. Fresh straw, new bucket, even dragged in the old feed, bin and scrubbed it down. It had taken hours, but I needed something to do with my hands, something to fix, something that didn't involve thinking. But the stall had stayed empty. Storm hadn't crossed the fence, not once. I took another sip and smiled bitterly. Guess we both got used to freedom. Later that afternoon, I tried again. Armed with carrots, a bristle brush, and too much hope, I opened the gate to the pasture and stepped inside. Storm lifted his head slightly but didn't back away. He let me approach, slowly, the way I had. As a girl when he was just a restless young gelding and I was a lonely child with dirt under my nails, I held out the carrot. He didn't move. "It's not poisoned," I said softly, trying to smile. My voice wavered. Then, slowly, he stepped forward. 1 step. 2. His lips brushed the carrot. Then he took it. Delicately, like a secret he was afraid to bite too hard. Good boy. I didn't cry this time. I didn't dare. Instead, I crouched beside him and began to brush the dirt from his flank, 1 slow stroke at a time. His coat was warm beneath the winter fuzz, and as I worked, I spoke quietly. About the city. About the burnout. About the days when getting out of bed had felt like climbing a mountain with no summit. He didn't answer, but his ears turned toward me, and he didn't move away. That was enough. When I paused to wipe my nose on my sleeve, I realized how close I was. My shoulder rested against his ribs. I could feel the rhythm of his breath, steady and patient. I leaned into him just a little, and for a moment, he didn't flinch. But then he stepped away. Just a few feet. Just enough. I swallowed hard. The fence between us wasn't made of wood or wire. It was in the air, in the ache between each cautious step. It was made of memories and mistakes and silence. That night, the wind picked up. I stood on the porch, wrapped in a thick blanket, watching the trees sway like dancers with broken spines. The stars were hidden behind layers of cloud, and the moon had gone to sleep behind the mountains. I thought of Storm, out in the pasture, alone. His stall was open, the barn was warm. He could come in if he wanted, but he didn't. Inside, I stoked the fire until it crackled bright and wild. I made tea I didn't drink and stared at the flames until they blurred. And then I opened my journal. I hadn't touched it in over a year. January 14th. I brushed him today. He let me. I forgot what it felt like to breathe with another living thing so close. It scared me. It made me feel alive. I stopped writing, then underlined the last sentence. It made me feel alive. The next morning, I woke to snow. Not a gentle dusting, but thick flakes piling fast and silent across the field. The world looked like someone had erased it and started over in white. Storm stood near the barn this time, coated in snow, unmoving. Ran out, forgetting my gloves. Storm. His ears twitched, and he turned his head slightly. But again, no steps forward. The wind cut through my coat like knives. I held out my hand, palm up, shaking. Please. The snowflakes melted on my skin. Storm took 1 step, then another, then stopped. I closed the gap between us. You stubborn boy, I murmured, just like me. I reached for his halter. He didn't pull away. Gently, I led him toward the barn. Each step sank deep into the new snow. By the time we reached the door, my boots were soaked and my fingers numb. Inside the barn, the warmth hit us both like a sigh. He shook his body, snow flying in all directions, then lowered his head and nudged my arm. A touch. Not a push. A question. I scratched behind his ears, heart thudding. You're okay, I whispered. You're home. For the first time, he walked into the stall without hesitation. That evening, I stayed in the barn long after sunset. I brought a heavy blanket from the cottage and laid it near the corner, then curled up beside the stall door, wrapped in wool and silence. The wind howled outside, but in here, the world was still. Storm lay down. Not often did he do that. Not unless he felt safe. I turned my head toward him and watched as he shifted his massive body to the straw, sighing like an old man. His eyes met mine across the space. "I'm still scared," I admitted aloud. He didn't blink, didn't move, but I want to try again. The wind pushed against the barn walls like a warning, but Storm didn't flinch. He didn't need words. He never had. And somehow, in that moment, the fence between us didn't feel so tall anymore. It started with a whisper, the kind of sound you barely notice until it's too loud to ignore. Wind curling through the rafters, the distant groan of trees. A warning. I had always hated storms. Even as a child, thunder felt like something personal, a reminder that the sky could shatter too, just like people. But tonight, as I sat beside Storm's stall with my knees tucked to my chest in the wool, blanket pulled tight around my shoulders, I didn't flinch at the first rumble in the distance. Not yet. Storm stood in the corner of his stall, calm but alert. His ears turned toward the door, then back toward me, then forward again. He knew what was coming. We both did. I reached out and touched the wooden post beside me, grounding myself. The air had shifted, warmer now, full of static. The kind of pressure that makes animals restless and humans fragile. The kind that makes you feel like something's about to break, and all you can do is wait. "Do you remember the last time it stormed?" I whispered. He didn't move. "You were barely, too. I tried to ride you during the first roll of thunder. Stupid, I know. You panicked and I flew. Landed face first in the pond." A soft snort. Barely audible. I smiled. "My grandfather said we were both too wild for our own good, that you'd never be tamed, and I'd never learn to sit still." Storm shifted slightly, weight moving from one leg to the other. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the metal latch on the barn door. I glanced toward it, heart stuttering. The first real crack of thunder rolled across the hills like a giant exhaling. It vibrated in my chest. Storm's head lifted, but he didn't panic. Not yet. The power had gone out an hour earlier. I hadn't noticed at first. The cottage was mostly candlelight and firewood anyway. But now the barn felt darker than before. Darker than night should be. The lantern on the hook above me flickered, and the shadows shifted like something alive. I should have gone back inside. Should have climbed into bed and pulled the blanket over my head like I used to. But something kept me here, the need to stay close. Not just for him, for me. Another crash of thunder, closer this time, and the first hard drops of rain began to strike the tin roof like tapping fingers, uneven and urgent. Storm tossed his head slightly. "It's all right," I said, rising slowly and walking to the stall gate. He stepped back but didn't turn. His eyes met mine. "You're not the only one who gets scared, you know." I opened the gate and stepped inside. My boots crunched softly against the straw. He watched me. When I reached him, I laid a hand gently against his shoulder. "Warm and tense. I'm here." We stood together in the dark. Rain drummed harder. The thunder clapped again, and this time Storm shivered beneath my palm. My own body echoed it. Fear, shared between two hearts. I slid down to the straw beside him and leaned against the rough wood of the stall. He remained standing, his hooves shifting just slightly, his breath heavier now. I could hear it over the storm, the rise and fall, fast and shallow. Panic was close. Not the thrashing kind. The quiet kind. The kind that creeps up behind you and squeezes until you forget how to move. I wrapped the blanket tighter around myself. "You don't have to be brave. Not tonight." A particularly violent gust of wind slammed into the barn door. Storm jerked and turned sharply toward the sound. "It's okay," I whispered quickly, standing again and reaching for his halter. "You're okay, Storm. He froze, nostrils flared, sides heaving. I touched his cheek and rested my forehead against his. His breath hitched, but then steadied. Just us. Just breath. Just the sound of the storm outside and the storm inside us trying not to win. And then the lights flickered back on. A sharp electric buzz. The sudden glow of the overhead bulb. Too much. Storm flinched hard, bumping into me with his shoulder. I stumbled but stayed upright. His body was tense, muscles coiled, ready to bolt. No, shh. It's okay, I said, voice trembling. I opened the stall door wide and moved to the corner of the barn, as far from the light as possible. I turned it off. Back to darkness. Soft and honest. Only the lantern remained, dim and warm. Storm stood frozen in the middle of the stall, still trembling, still watching. I held my arms open slightly. Come here. He didn't move. I know, you're scared. Me too. My voice cracked. I hate this. All of it. I sank to the ground again, pulled the wool blanket over me and sat cross-legged against the wall. The barn groaned as another wave of wind passed over the roof. I looked, down at my hands. I hate being weak, and that's when I heard it. Not thunder. Not wind, movement, slow, heavy, deliberate. I looked up. Storm was stepping forward, toward me. My heart leapt to my throat. I didn't dare breathe. He paused a few feet away, snorted softly, then dropped to his knees in the straw with a low grunt, and lowered himself beside me. I stared. He hadn't done that since he was a foal. Not near me, not beside me, not voluntarily. His head rested near my feet. His eyes stayed open, watching. And then, slowly, he shifted closer. Closer, until part of his massive body leaned against mine. Until I could feel his warmth through the blanket. Until he moved his head beneath it, under the blanket, right into my lap. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move. His weight, his heat, the scent of straw and earth and horse. It was overwhelming. His neck stretched across my thighs, head tucked under my arm, and the blanket sagged over him like a tent collapsing. I felt trapped. Not by fear, by emotion. I couldn't breathe. Not because of the physical pressure, but because every wall I'd built around myself had just cracked open, all at once. And the grief came rushing in like water into a sinking ship. I clutched the blanket tight with one hand and stroked his neck with the other. My fingers trembled. I left, I whispered. And you still let me come back. Storm didn't move. I broke everything. I shut it all down. I couldn't take care of anyone, not even myself. My throat closed. The tears returned. And still, he stayed. Heavy, real, solid against me. A silent answer to everything I couldn't say. I'm sorry, I sobbed. I don't know how long we sat like that, horse and woman, wrapped in wool and stormlight. But slowly the panic ebbed. My lungs remembered how to draw breath again. Deep and raw and alive. And for the first time in years, I let myself cry without shame. Storm's ear flicked once under the blanket. Then he pressed closer, as if to say, I'm here, and I'm not leaving either. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. My eyes may have closed, and time may have passed. But real sleep never came. Not with Storm curled against me like a mountain draped in muscle and warmth. And not with the storm clawing at the barn like it wanted in. At some point, the wind tore, a loose sheet of tin from the roof. The bang was sharp enough to make my heart stop, but Storm didn't bolt. He shifted, lifted his head from my lap, then laid it back down gently, as if to say, "Still here. Still safe. Still us." I ran my hand slowly along his neck, under the edge of the blanket, fingers threading through the coarse winter coat. I was breathing again, each inhale shaky but real. The air smelled of wet hay and damp earth and something else. Something faint but sharp. My mind caught it and froze. Smoke. I sat upright, heart hammering. Storm raised his head, ears twitching toward the barn door. Smoke. No doubt now. Not from the fireplace in the cottage. This was different. Closer. Wrong. I scrambled to my feet, the blanket falling from my shoulders. My knees buckled, stiff from hours on the cold ground. But I pushed forward, unlatching the stall gate and stumbling out into the main corridor of the barn. A low haze hovered near the floor, drifting in through the seams of the old wooden planks. I ran to the side door and wrenched it open. The wind slammed it against the wall and I stumbled outside. To the right, near the back of the barn, thin tendrils of smoke curled from a pile of rotted boards and leaves I'd meant to clear weeks ago. Embers glowed red at the base. Lightning. It must have struck during the storm. One bolt, one spark, in the wrong place. And here it was, creeping across the damp ground with terrifying intention. Damn it! I spun back toward the barn. Storm! He hadn't moved. He stood at the stall gate now, watching me, body tense. I ran back to him, unlatched the stall, and grabbed the halter. We have to go. But he didn't follow. Storm! My voice cracked. Come on! He lowered his head and took one slow step forward, but stopped. I followed his gaze. The blanket, still lying in the straw. I stared at it, then at him. No, I said, breath shallow. You're not waiting for me to take it. But he didn't move. The fire wasn't close enough to be dangerous yet. But it would be. I grabbed the blanket and threw it over my shoulder. Happy now? Only then did he follow me out of the barn. The wind howled as we reached the pasture. I led Storm to the far fence line, well away from the creeping smoke. The snow from earlier was turning to slush beneath our feet. My breath came in visible bursts, each one jagged and hot against the frozen air. I opened the gate to the old paddock beyond the barn, a place overgrown and unused for years, and ushered him inside. The moment I closed the latch, he turned to face me. Not skittish, not wild, just alert, waiting. I dropped the blanket in the grass and bent over, hands on my knees, heart still racing. I don't get it, I whispered, mostly to myself. Why the blanket? Why now? No answer, of course. Just wind, and the faint hiss of the fire somewhere behind the barn. But I felt it, like a thread pulled tight between us. That moment last night, when he'd climbed under the blanket with me, it hadn't been random. It hadn't been instinct. It had been trust. A bridge. A question answered in silence. And now he expected me to carry that forward. Not retreat. All right, I muttered. I get it. I stood again, and together we watched the sky lighten slowly. The storm was passing. The fire had already started to die under the weight of the melting snow and slush. I'd call the fire department just to be safe. But for now, the danger was receding. It was the inside of me that was still burning. Later that morning, once the fire crew had confirmed the barn was stable and the last embers were dead, I sat on the porch with the blanket wrapped tight around my shoulders. Storm stood across the pasture, grazing, his tail flicking idly. The wind had calmed. The air smelled clean again, and I felt shaken. Not because of the fire, not because of the barn, but because of what I'd seen in myself the moment I smelled. Smoke, the old panic, the way it choked me. the way I froze before I moved, the way fear still ruled parts of me that I thought I'd buried. I pulled the blanket tighter. My fingers brushed against a small patch near the seam, rougher, thicker. Then the rest, a tear from last night, or maybe older. I pressed it gently, and something inside me shifted. This blanket, this stupid old wool thing, had become a symbol of everything I'd tried not to feel. And last night, Storm had climbed under it, not to protect himself, but to reach me. That night in the barn wasn't about comfort. It was about surrender, about trust, about letting the weight in so you could finally breathe through it instead of around it. I stood, heart pounding, and walked across the yard. The sun broke through the clouds in pale rays, warming my skin as I approached the pasture gate. Storm looked up. I stepped inside. This time I didn't stop. I walked straight to him and dropped the blanket in the grass again, an offering. Not because he asked for it, but because I was done hiding under it. He nudged my hand, then lowered his head to sniff the blanket. I touched his neck, and I said, "I'm ready." We started slow. Each day, I walked Storm in quiet circles around the paddock. I brushed him. I talked to him. I fed him apples and let him lean his weight against my side as if to say, "Still here, still us." And one morning he let me climb on bareback, just for a moment. Just a single breath between two hearts. I didn't ride far. I didn't need to. Because the moment I settled on his back, I realized something terrifying and beautiful at once. I wasn't scared. Not of falling. Not of failing. Not of breathing too deeply anymore. Because the blanket he'd once curled under with me, he'd handed it back in silence, and I was the one who chose to let it go. That night, I folded the blanket carefully and placed it on the shelf inside the barn. I didn't burn it. I didn't throw it away. It wasn't shameful. It was part of the story. Just like the fire. Just like the fear. Just like the girl who had driven away and the woman who had found her way back. As I turned to leave, I glanced over my shoulder. Storm stood just outside the barn door watching. I smiled. "Come on, boy," I said, stepping into the night. "We've got more fences to tear down." Some moments are so quiet, they feel louder than thunder. That's how it felt on the morning I let him run again. The sky was clear, brilliant and blue, like someone had scrubbed the sadness from it. Thin lines of frost-etched patterns on the grass, melting under the first touch of sun. I stood by the fence, the same one that had once divided us, and watched Storm paw the ground like he was waiting for permission to remember who he was. And maybe, in some way, waiting for me to remember who I was too. "All right," I whispered, more to myself than to him. I opened the gate. He didn't bolt. He didn't rear or gallop straight out. He stepped through with the calm, calculated grace of something powerful that chooses stillness over show. He walked a few paces into the open field, stopped, and turned his head to look back. I held my breath. He wanted me to follow. The wide pasture hadn't been used in years. It stretched all the way to the edge of the forest, a place of golden light and damp moss where my grandfather once took me riding in the early mornings. I'd forgotten how big it was, how wild. Out here, there were no fences, no limits, just space. Storm took off suddenly, like a bowstring snapping. His legs flew beneath him, dark mane streaming like fire behind a comet. He cut across the field in wide arcs, body low and fast, hooves kicking up tufts of frost and earth. Every turn was a question. Every gallop a dare. "Come with me." I ran after him, not because I thought I could catch him. I didn't want to. I just wanted to be part of it. His freedom, his power, his joy. The laugh that escaped my throat surprised me. I hadn't heard it in years. Not like that. Raw. Real. He slowed near the tree line and turned again, trotting back toward me. My breath came in bursts, fogging the morning air. I stopped when he reached me and let him press his muzzle into my palm. I needed that, I said, smiling through the sweat on my brow. Storm bumped me gently with his head like an answer. We walked the rest of the way together, side by side, no halter, no reins. Just a woman and a horse and the kind of silence that doesn't demand to be filled. That afternoon, I got a call I hadn't expected. It was Jenna, my manager back in the city. My phone had been off for days, but she'd finally gotten through. "Clara, hey, are you all right? You just disappeared." "I know," I said, heart sinking slightly. There was a pause. "Listen, I don't want to push, but the office has been scrambling without you. We had 2 clients walk last week. If you want your job back, I think I can still fight for it. Fight for it, as if I hadn't been fighting for every breath for the past 3 years. I'm not coming back," I said softly. Another pause. "You're sure?" I looked out at Storm, grazing lazily under the pale sun, his body no longer tense, no longer watching for signs that I might vanish again. "I'm sure." That night, I sat in the barn again. Same blanket, same straw, same heartbeat, but different. Somehow, Storm rested behind me, stretched out in his stall, completely relaxed. Trust, not just rebuilt, but rooted. I opened my journal. February 3rd. He ran today, and I ran after him. Not because I had to, but because I could. I think I'm ready to breathe again. Really breathe. I closed the journal. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I needed to write anything else. The knock came late. So late that for a moment I thought I imagined it. I'd been curled on the sofa, drifting between memories and dreams. The fire just a dim glow now. Another knock. Real. Firm. I stood, cautious, and opened the door. And there he was. Ethan, my ex. Wearing a soaked coat, backpack slung over one shoulder, and an expression caught somewhere between desperation and disbelief. "I wasn't sure you'd be here," he said. I stared at him, stunned. "How did you—" "Your mom," he said quickly. "She gave me the address when I said I was worried. Said you hadn't answered her calls either." I stepped back automatically, letting him in without realizing it. The air between us felt sharp, like stepping into cold water. He looked around, shivering slightly. "You look different." I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. "Just, I've been thinking," he continued, "about everything. I know things got bad. I know I didn't show up when it mattered. Still, I said nothing." He looked at me then, really looked. "But I'm here now. That used to be enough." The promise of now, the apology wrapped in a gesture, but not anymore. "I'm not," I said. He blinked. "What?" "I'm not still there. In that version of me. In that apartment. That job. That life." I folded my arms. I came here to remember who I was, before everything cracked. He looked hurt, but not surprised. "I just thought maybe we could talk." "We just did," I said quietly. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind pressing softly against the windows. Finally, he nodded, eyes heavy. "Okay." He turned to leave, and I watched him go. No anger, no grief. Just the gentle closure of a chapter that had ended long ago. I closed the door behind him, and I didn't cry. The next morning, Storm waited at the fence again. But this time, when I opened the gate, he came without hesitation. I walked him past the barn, through the woods, and into the wide-open pasture that backed up against the hills. The air was sharp and full of sun, and I climbed onto his back. No saddle, no reins, just trust. He stood still as I settled, then took one slow step, and then another. I let my fingers run through his mane, and for a long time, we simply wandered. No destination. No agenda. At the edge of the ridge, I looked down over the valley, the cottage in the distance, the barn roof patched and gleaming, the pasture stretching toward something that looked a lot like peace. Storm turned his head slightly, ears flicking toward me, and I did it. I closed my eyes, inhaled deeply, and breathed. Not like someone who was trying to survive, but like someone who had finally remembered how it felt to be alive.